Section 1. The question nobody asks, but everyone should. There is a question buried somewhere in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 that most people walk right past without even noticing it. It does not have a dramatic title. It does not appear in any codex as a highlighted sidebar. Nobody has made a speech about it in the grand halls of the Imperial Palace. Nobody painted it in bold letters across the front of a black library novel. And yet, once you really see it, once you actually sit with it for a moment and let it breathe, it starts to unravel something genuinely fascinating about the way this universe works at its deepest levels. The question is this: why don't orcs fight custodians? Or, more precisely, why don't the orcs seek out the custodians? Why, in a setting where one of the most numerous, most aggressive, most perpetually war-hungry species in the galaxy spills its violence across virtually every corner of inhabited space, do the Golden Warriors of the Emperor's personal guard exist in a kind of strange proximity to the orc menace without being its primary target? The orcs have attacked and consumed entire chapters of Space Marines. They have swallowed planetary systems and reduced them to smoldering ruin. They have brought their green tide crashing against the walls of humanity's greatest fortress and threatened the throne world itself with orbital weapons of unprecedented scale. And yet, the specific golden-armored individuals standing just inside those walls, 10,000 of the most capable warriors ever to walk on two legs in human form, are not the thing that the orc tide specifically orients itself toward. Think about that for a moment, because it is genuinely strange when you hold it against everything you know about what orcs actually are. Now, the reflexive answer most people give when this question comes up is something like, well, orcs will fight anything. So they probably do fight custodians sometimes when the opportunity arises. And a second reflexive answer follows quickly. Custodians barely leave Terra, so there simply aren't many opportunities for a fight to begin with. Both of those things contain real truth. The custodians are historically rare in the wider galaxy, and their deployment history is unusual, and the structural realities of where they are positioned versus where orc crusades tend to travel does explain a significant portion of why these two forces do not regularly engage. But that explanation, while accurate, is incomplete. And the incompleteness is where all the interesting things live. Because here is the thing about orcs. Deeply, fundamentally, at the level of their genes and their neurons, and the strange collective psychic field that bleeds out of them in all directions constantly, they are not simply aggressive in the way that a mean dog is aggressive, or in the way that a cornered animal lashes out when it has nowhere to go. Orcs are aggressive the way the ocean is wet. It is not a behavior they perform. It is not a stance they adopt. It is a fundamental property of their existence, as inescapable as their green skin and as constant as their heartbeat, written into their biological code by being so ancient that the universe itself has largely forgotten they ever lived. Everything in the galaxy has at some point tried to avoid fighting orcs. Everything has, at various points, failed at that avoidance. The Eldar craft worlds, with all their foresight and all their psychic mastery, have been overrun by green tides that moved faster than the paths their seers had charted. Necron tomb worlds, awakening after millions of years of dreamless metal sleep to find planets of spores and fungi and shrieking greenskins, have found themselves in the position of fighting a war on their own territory before they had properly assessed the situation. Tyrannid splinter fleets, those biological horror ships, guided by a collective alien intelligence, have encountered orc crusades moving in the same region of space and fallen into combat with them purely because the encounter happened, and orcs never walk away from an encounter. The Tau, with their sophisticated philosophy and their careful approach to strategic resource allocation, have spent considerable energy trying to integrate orc mercenaries into their military structures with mixed results, because orcs are fundamentally not integrable into anyone else's framework. They fight. They fight everything. They fight each other when there is nothing else available. They fight because fighting is the orcs' answer to every question the universe asks. And yet, despite all of that, despite the howling, churning, all-consuming tide of violence that every orc embodies and projects outward in every direction at every waking moment, the custodians are not the specific priority. The Golden Warriors, who stand nearly 9 feet tall in auramite plate, trained across centuries in 100 modes of killing, protected by something that the lore describes as the Emperor's own warding made manifest. The Orks, by and large, do not go looking for them. Why? The answer requires traveling through multiple layers of this universe, each one adding something essential to the picture. We need to understand what an orc actually is, not in the comfortable shorthand of big green aliens, but in the deep biological and psychological sense that determines how they interact with everything around them. We need to understand what a custodian actually is, which turns out to be a question with a more complex answer than most people assume. We need to understand the most significant documented meeting between these two forces, a battle so lopsided that its numbers read like a misprint until you understand what caused them. We need to understand the deployment patterns and strategic geography that shape where each force appears and why. And we need to address one more dimension that lives below the surface of all of this, the psychic one, where the Orcs' collective field meets something in the Custodians' nature that does not respond the way ordinary things respond. So settle in, take your time. This is going to build slowly, piece by piece, until the whole picture comes together, and once you see it, you will not unsee it. The story begins a very long time ago, longer than the Imperium, longer than the Emperor's birth on old Earth, longer than humanity has any memory of, in an age of beings and wars so ancient that what we call history today is a footnote to a footnote in the chronicles of what was already ancient then. Before we dive into the deep lore, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Whether you're settling in for a quiet evening somewhere, killing time on a commute, or winding down after a long day, I genuinely love knowing where this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a very good moment. There is a great deal more of this to come. Section 2. What an orc actually is: the war machine that outlived its makers. To understand why orcs do or don't do anything, you have to understand what orcs actually are at the most fundamental level. Not in the comfortable shorthand of big green aliens who like to fight, even though that shorthand is accurate as far as it goes. That description is to the real biology and psychology of the orc. What saying the sun is hot is to nuclear fusion. Technically true, leaves out everything that matters. Orcs are, at the most fundamental biological level, a fusion of two kingdoms of life that do not coexist in any natural system on any planet that arose without outside intervention. Part animal, part fungus. These two things have been welded together at the genetic level with a sophistication that the Adeptus Mechanicus, with all its accumulated knowledge and recovered ancient technology, has never fully managed to reverse engineer. The fact that orcs are built this way is not an evolutionary accident. It is not natural selection producing a hybrid form over millions of generations of environmental pressure. It is the result of deliberate, extraordinarily sophisticated genetic engineering performed by a civilization so ancient, so advanced, and so utterly gone that their very existence survives today, mostly in the myths of the species they created and in the half-understood ruins scattered across the oldest reaches of the galaxy. The Old Ones, a reptilian species, sometimes remembered in the corrupted genetic memory of orcs as the Brain Boys, though that particular name has its own complex and debated history within orc oral tradition. What matters is this: somewhere around 60 million years ago, the Old Ones found themselves in a war they were losing. The Necron, skeletal deathless warriors bound to ancient star gods called the Cetan, were grinding them down across the galaxy. The Old Ones were extraordinarily advanced in biological engineering. They had seeded life on countless worlds, elevated species from primitive states, shaped the living landscape of the galaxy to purposes we can barely imagine. But they were not winning. In their need, they created the Krork, not soldiers in any conventional sense, engines, living weapons designed from the ground up for a single overriding purpose, self-sustaining on any world they touched, self-replicating through a reproductive system that required nothing external, functionally impossible to eradicate from any environment in which they established themselves, designed to fight at scales that even the Cetan's vast metallic armies would struggle to handle. The war was eventually won, or at least survived. The Old Ones fell anyway, destroyed by the catastrophic side effects of a war that had unintentionally created entire new dimensions of psychic reality and the things that lived in them. But their Krork survived. And over 60 million years of feral persistence, without masters, without direction, without enemies sophisticated enough to truly challenge them, the Krork degraded into the Orks of the modern era, still carrying the old one's design in every cell, still running the program they were built to run, even though the architects who wrote it are dust, and the war they were made to fight is so ancient, it might as well be myth. The animal side of the Ork gives them their aggression, their pack instincts, their hunger for hierarchy and dominance. This side is recognizable in biological terms, an apex predator wired for competition and combat. The fungal side is where things become genuinely alien. Fungus as a biological strategy operates on entirely different principles from animal biology. It does not require the complex internal organ systems that animals depend on. It can survive in environments that would kill any animal outright. It reproduces through spores rather than through the sexual reproduction that most complex animals rely on, and those spores can remain viable for extraordinarily long periods under extraordinarily hostile conditions. And critically, fungal biology can handle nutrition, waste processing, and tissue maintenance through mechanisms that bypass the need for specialized organs. Every orc, throughout its entire life, sheds microscopic spores from its body continuously. These settle into the environment, the soil, the rock, the crevices of whatever structure the orc is moving through, the dust of whatever world it walks on. When an orc is injured, it releases a burst of spores as part of its biological stress response, a system that ensures even a wounded orc is seeding the local environment. When an orc dies, it releases a concentrated cloud of spores in its final moments, far more than it generates through its entire living life. These spores germinate. They grow in the patient, unhurried way that fungal growth proceeds, producing underground structures that eventually, over weeks or months depending on environmental conditions, generate the entire orcoid ecosystem. Not just orcs, the Gretchen servants, and the snotlings who tend the fungal gardens, and the squigs who serve as livestock and tools and companions, all emerge from the same spore stock. The orcoid biome is entirely self-contained and self-generating. This reproductive strategy creates the defining characteristic of the orc as a military and ecological threat. They are essentially impossible to permanently eradicate from any planet they have inhabited. A world successfully conquered from the orcs, the green tide apparently destroyed, its warriors killed to the last, remains infested at the spore level for decades. The ground is seeded, the rock is contaminated. Eventually, 5 years, 20 years, 50 years, feral orcs begin to appear from the wilderness, having grown unobserved from the fungal legacy of their predecessors. And what was believed to be a finished problem becomes immediately an unfinished one again. Imperial commanders have gone to sleep in what they thought were secured territories and woken up to a resurgent orc infestation that emerged from soil they had thought was clean. It is one of the most maddening aspects of the orc as an enemy. You cannot simply win and be done. The victory is always temporary, in a way that no other enemy can quite match. The orc body itself builds on this foundation in ways that make them extraordinarily hard to kill, even in single engagements. Their internal organs are simplified and streamlined, the complex biochemical machinery of most advanced organisms replaced by a body cavity-filling fungal substrate that handles nutrition, waste processing, immune function, and tissue repair simultaneously through crude but highly redundant mechanisms. Orcs have 2 hearts, one of which doubles as a primary digestive organ, processing the nutrient-rich fungal elements of their blood. Their arteries are so muscular that they can circulate blood without a functioning heart for some time. The fungal substrate serves as a distributed immune system that does not require the specialized lymphatic architecture of most complex organisms, reacting to pathogens and foreign substances through simple absorption and neutralization rather than the complex adaptive response of more vulnerable biologies. The bones of an orc are dense and hard, and capable of absorbing impacts that would shatter the skeletal structure of any other humanoid species. The skin is green not merely as a pigment, but as a function. The chlorophyll-rich algae woven through their cellular structure allows orcs to photosynthesize, deriving supplementary energy directly from sunlight. This is not enough to sustain them without food, but it meaningfully reduces their dependence on supply lines in a way that no other military force in the setting can claim. You cannot starve an orc army by cutting its logistics, because the army will stand in sunlight and feed from it and keep moving. The skin also grows thicker and more calloused as the orc ages and fights, building up a natural armor layer over muscle and bone that makes veteran orcs harder to damage at the surface level before their actual armor even enters the calculation. Orcs feel pain differently to most organisms. The neurological pathway from pain input to behavioral inhibition is dramatically suppressed compared to any other species. The orc registers damage the signal, exists, and is useful, but the magnitude of behavioral response is reduced to the point where most injuries that would debilitate any other species simply do not stop an orc from continuing. It's immediate activity. Losing a limb is an inconvenience. A serious torso wound is an obstacle. What would be a fatal injury for a space marine is something an orc can continue fighting through on biological momentum for a surprising period. There are well-documented accounts, recorded by Imperial physicians and xenobiologists, of orcs fighting for minutes after injuries that should have been immediately lethal, of orc severed heads remaining animate and aggressive on the ground after separation from the body, of orc bodies that continued to move and strike long after the degree of damage inflicted should have terminated all function. Orc pain boys, those specialists who serve as the greenskins' rough approximation of surgeons, can reattach limbs and organs with a crudeness that should consistently kill their patients and frequently does not, because the fungal biology does enough of the repair work on its own that the pain boy's primary job is just to hold the pieces in approximately the right orientation while the organism handles the rest. Their methods involve staples and wire and improvised bionics made from scrap metal, and their patients emerge from treatment substantially modified from their original configuration, but they emerge alive and functional with a consistency that should not be possible given the techniques involved. All of this physical resilience feeds into a psychology that has no real equivalent anywhere else in this universe. Orcs do not experience fear in the way most organisms do. This is not a statement about willpower or spiritual fortitude. It is a statement about neurological architecture. The circuit that in most organisms connects threat detection to behavioral inhibition, the pathway that produces retreat, submission, avoidance, is simply not wired the same way in an orc. The threshold for producing inhibitory behavioral outputs is set so high that it essentially never activates in any normal combat scenario. The orc detects threats. It responds to them. But the response is not withdrawal. The response is engagement, and if the threat is larger than usual, the response is more enthusiastic engagement, because a larger threat means a more interesting fight. This is not stupidity, to be clear. Orcs can demonstrate real cunning. War bosses show genuine tactical intelligence. The most evolved orc entities, at the heights of what the species is capable of, have demonstrated sophistication that genuinely surprised organizations that had underestimated them. But the fundamental relationship with danger is different. The orc lives entirely in the present moment, oriented entirely toward the immediate encounter, without the self-preservation calculus that most other species apply constantly and unconsciously to every situation they find themselves in. And then there is the collective. The psychic field that orcs generate is one of the most extraordinary and underappreciated phenomena in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Every single orc is a low-grade psychic entity, not a psyker in the sense of an individual who can draw from the warp and direct it as a weapon, but something more fundamental. Every orc, simply by existing and being the kind of creature it is, generates a small amount of psychic energy as an ambient output of its biology. Individually, this contribution to the local psychic environment is essentially undetectable, but orcs do not exist individually. They gather drawn together by the field itself, which pulls at them the way a current pulls at debris in water and in sufficient numbers. Their combined output becomes something that affects the real world in measurable ways. Orc technology, when subjected to serious analysis by Imperial engineers and the Adeptus Mechanicus, should not function. The verdict is not even close. The crude pipe assemblies and spring-loaded mechanisms and salvaged component combinations that Ork mechboys assemble from whatever scraps are available should not produce the energy output they produce. Ork vehicles assembled without engineering knowledge, held together with wire and improvised fasteners, should not achieve the speeds they achieve. Improvised explosive devices, built without any understanding of chemistry or physics, should not generate the blast radius they generate. By every physical law the Imperium understands, Ork technology is impossible. It works because enough Orks believe it will work. This is not metaphor. It is not a simplified description of something more conventional. The collective belief of sufficient numbers of Orks, channeled through their Gestalt psychic field, actually bends the behavior of physical matter. The famous examples are the color associations. Orks believe that vehicles painted red move faster. Measured empirically, in the presence of a sufficient number of Orks maintaining that belief through the field, red Ork vehicles actually do move faster. Yellow is associated with bigger explosions, and yellow Ork munitions actually do produce larger explosions. Blue is lucky. Purple is considered sneaky, hence the observation that you never see a purple Ork, because the psychology is self-fulfilling, and any Ork that painted itself purple would be assumed to be hiding, and would therefore be more likely to be treated as if it were hiding, and the Ork would find itself in the role its appearance had assigned it. The color beliefs are not cultural folklore. They are documented physical phenomena. The field grows more powerful as Orks gather in greater numbers, and as the intensity of their emotional and physical engagement increases. A small warband of a few hundred Orks produces a field that creates what you might describe as local probability, whether slight biases in outcomes, a tendency for Ork equipment to operate at its theoretical maximum, a slight but measurable depression of enemy fortune in the vicinity. A crusade of millions in full battle frenzy produces a field so powerful it can affect atmospheric conditions, cause enemy equipment to fail at rates that cannot be explained by ordinary malfunction, and amplify the individual Orks within it to levels of physical capability they could not achieve in isolation. This is what you are fighting when you fight the Orks. Not just individual soldiers with individual capabilities. A system, a self-sustaining, self-amplifying ecosystem of violence in which every element feeds every other element, where the killing of individual Orks both seeds the ground for future generations and adds to the field's intensity while the killing is happening, where the whole is enormously greater than the sum of its parts. A species designed by ancient intelligence specifically to be this impossible to stop, impossible to eradicate, impossible to reason with, impossible to wear down through any form of attrition that the universe has yet produced. This is the creature that turns its eyes toward the golden wall of the imperial palace and evaluates what it sees. Section 3. What a custodian actually is. The Emperor's most personal work. If you want to understand the Adeptus Custodes at more than a surface level, the first thing to do is stop reaching for the Space Marine comparison. Not because the comparison is entirely wrong, but because it leads you to a mental model that misses what is actually significant. If you think of a custodian as an upgraded Space Marine, a more expensive, harder-to-produce version of the same basic product, you will understand the statistics but miss the philosophy, and the philosophy is where the most important truths about the 10,000 live. The Space Marine is made through a process that is, for all its extraordinary results, fundamentally additive. A human adolescent of appropriate age and genetic compatibility is surgically implanted with 19 gene seed organs derived from a Primarch's template. These organs mature and integrate over years, each one adding a specific capability to the human foundation. The Biscopia builds muscle mass beyond natural limits. The os modula strengthens and reshapes the skeleton. The neuroglottis refines the senses. The preomnor adapts the digestive system. And so on through the list. The Marine becomes transhuman through a process of layering new capabilities onto a human substrate that remains essentially recognizable throughout. A Space Marine remembers being human. They have names from before the transformation, memories of their life before the chapter claimed them, emotional connections to where they came from. The chapter honors this. The initiation rites preserve continuity with the human past, even as they build radically beyond it. The Marine is human first and transhuman second, in the sense that the human was already there and the transhuman was added. The Custodian's creation is described in entirely different terms. Potential custodians are taken at a very young age. Some sources suggest late infancy, the earliest possible stage at which the process can begin, before the body has begun its developmental trajectory in any fixed way. What is done to them is not described as implantation or augmentation. It is described as transformation, a rebuilding, at the most fundamental biological levels, that the Emperor conducted personally for each individual warrior. Not through the apothecary system with its standardized protocols, not through a replicable process delegated to subordinates. The Emperor gave each custodian his personal attention, his personal knowledge, his personal craft. This is a statement worth sitting with. The Emperor, who could have been producing Space Marine legions in the hundreds of thousands, chose to give his personal attention to the creation of a guard that would never number more than 10,000. The implication in the lore is that each custodian required something only the Emperor could provide, some element of his own understanding, his own genetic artistry, perhaps literally something of his own biological essence that could not be bottled into a standardized gene seed and reproduced by apothecaries following written procedures. What emerges from this process is not a human with enhancements. It is something the lore describes as having never quite been human in the way a Space Marine was, because the foundation itself was rebuilt so fundamentally that calling it a human is the kind of category mistake you make when you call a sculpture a block of stone. The material was human once. What it became is something else entirely. The physical results begin with a body that stands close to 9 feet tall before any armor is considered. Not 7 feet like a Space Marine. Not even 8, closer to 9, in the proportions of a being that was engineered to be exactly this size and shape, proportionally stronger than this size alone would imply, because the muscles were rebuilt rather than merely enlarged. Proportionally faster than a Space Marine in every reaction time metric, with perceptual and neural processing speeds that the lore describes in multiple places as bordering on what looks like foreknowledge, reading an opponent's movement before the movement fully registers as movement, responding to the ghost of an attack before the attack itself materializes. Proportionally more resilient in healing, in sustained endurance under combat conditions, in tolerance for damage, and continued function after injury. The sources describe custodians in relation to Space Marines the same way Space Marines are described in relation to ordinary guardsmen. That ratio is worth holding in your mind. The gap between a trained soldier and a transhuman Space Marine is described throughout the lore as enormous orders of magnitude in terms of individual combat effectiveness, categories of capability that the human simply does not possess and cannot acquire through training alone. Apply that gap again, starting from the Space Marine as your baseline rather than the guardsman, and you begin to sketch the outline of where a custodian actually sits. The armor they wear is called custodian armor, and it is not made of ceramite, it is made of auramite. Auramite is an extraordinarily rare material of unknown origin, golden in its natural color, which possesses a specific and important property. It is almost entirely inert at the quantum level in relation to psychic energy. Ceramite, the material of Space Marine armor, is itself quite resistant to many forms of psychic manipulation. But auramite goes further. It does not impede the flow of psychic power in either direction, making it essentially transparent to etheric energy. This is why the Emperor chose it for his own armor. Not for physical protection alone, though it is described as effectively impenetrable, but because wearing auramite allowed him to channel the immense psychic forces he directed without the armor interfering with that flow. Ceramite would have created resistance. Auramite allowed everything through. Every suit of custodian armor is individually crafted for the specific custodian who will wear it, fitted to their exact dimensions and optimized for their specific fighting style. The name of the owner is inscribed on the interior of the suit, invisible from outside, a private inscription between the maker and the wearer. The suits are inlaid with gems mined from Terra's own rock, incorporated into the sensor and field generation arrays that give the armor capabilities beyond simple physical protection. Built-in grav chutes and internal air supplies for operation in environments without atmosphere. Ambient neutralizers and Vox systems, and holographic display overlays. refraction field generators that add a secondary layer of protection beyond the physical resistance of the auramite itself. Each suit is, by the repeated estimation of those who have encountered them, a planet's ransom in materials and craftsmanship, and each one is irreplaceable. The Guardian Spear that serves as the Custodian's signature weapon is so massive that several ordinary humans working together could not lift it. This is not rhetorical. It is the practical consequence of incorporating power field generators and structural reinforcement into a weapon whose blade alone represents a significant mass of materials. In the hands of a Custodian, this mass is irrelevant. The enhanced strength and the strength-amplifying servos of the armor make the weapon's weight a non-factor, and centuries of practice with it have made its use effortless in the way that only things practiced for centuries become effortless. The powered blade can cut through a Chaos Space Marine in a single swing. The integrated bolt weapon fires with the precision of a dedicated marksman. In combat, Custodians spin these weapons in great arcs. Every revolution simultaneously a defensive movement and an offensive strike, clearing space around them in patterns that require absolute mastery of both the weapon and the environment. Each Guardian Spear is unique. Each one is a master-crafted individual work, constructed by hand by the weapon cults sworn to the Custodians, maintained and improved over the lifetime of the Custodian who wields it. And then there is the quality that the lore treats most carefully, because it exists at the edge of what ordinary description can handle, the Emperor's touch. The cellular alchemy of the Custodian's creation leaves behind something the texts call a spark of the Emperor's own greatness. This manifests in combat as what the sources describe as an almost supernatural warding bullets turning aside at the last moment, blades failing to find the purchase they should have found, psychic powers directed at Custodians, flickering and dying at the moment of application. These are documented as real effects, not metaphors. Enemies who have engaged Custodians in battle and analyze the engagement afterward note a pattern of projectiles and weapons failing to achieve their expected results against these targets at rates that cannot be accounted for by ordinary probability. The warding is real. It is built into what the Custodians are, inherited from the process that made them. Their training, conducted across lifetimes without the biological clock that limits mortal warriors, encompasses fighting systems called martial katas. These are not merely techniques. They are complete philosophies of violence, each one an integrated approach to a specific category of combat problem, a specific opponent, a specific tactical situation. Custodians master not one of these, but dozens or more over their service lives, and the ability to shift between them in combat, reading the developing situation, and changing one's entire approach mid-engagement requires the kind of deep, embodied understanding that can only come from practicing something to the point where it becomes reflex rather than thought. This is what a Custodian is, and this is what stands between the Orktide and the Golden Throne. Section 4. The Hierarchy of Violence, How Orks Decide What to Fight. To understand the specific relationship between Orks and Custodians, you need to understand something quite specific about how Orks make what we might loosely call decisions about who or what to fight, because there is a process happening here, even if it is not conscious in the human sense, and that process has inputs and outputs that illuminate why Custodians are not the natural priority target for the Ork. Ork society is organized by the most biologically enforced hierarchy in the setting. The biggest Ork is in charge, not metaphorically, not as a way of saying that Ork society values strength, literally. The biggest Ork in any gathering is the boss, and the Ork hierarchy is determined entirely by size, which is determined entirely by success in combat, which feeds back into further size growth through a hormonal and metabolic response that the Ork's biology has been running since the species was engineered by the old ones. An Ork that wins fights grows. The more it wins, the more it grows. The war boss, who leads a major crusade, towers over his knobs not merely because of some selective pressure that produced big war bosses over time. He towers over them because the biological feedback loop between victory and growth has been running in his favor continuously for decades or centuries. He literally is bigger because he has been winning longer. and the psychic field broadcasts this constantly, so that every orc within range knows, at a sensory level below conscious thought, where every other orc ranks in the hierarchy. The orc does not calculate this, it feels it. This same instinct applies to non-orc opponents. The orc's primary environmental evaluation tool assesses everything around it for size, power, and threat level, not through formal analysis, through something more like the way an apex predator reads the body language of other animals, automatic, quick, and deeply reliable. The orc looks at an opponent, and its nervous system tells it, immediately, whether this is prey, a worthy opponent, or something that sits in a different category. Small enemies are prey. Medium enemies are a good fight. Large enemies, genuinely powerful ones that register on the orc's assessment system as representing a real challenge, are the coveted prize, the kind of opponent that makes a warboss famous if he wins. Here is the nuance that gets missed in casual discussion. The orc love of fighting is not the same as a suicidal disregard for all outcomes. The desire for combat is coupled with a desire to continue having combat, which requires not dying. An orc that dies in a fight it could never have won does not achieve a glorious death in orc cultural terms. It simply stops, without the chance to grow, without the chance to accumulate victory and become something more than it was. The drive toward combat and the drive toward survival are both present in orc biology. The survival drive simply has a much higher threshold before it overrides the combat drive than it does in most other species. When the field is amplifying a large mob, this threshold shifts dramatically. The collective psychic energy of thousands of orcs in battle frenzy suppresses individual self-assessment entirely, replacing it with something more like a tide pure forward momentum. The individual orc, carried along by the mass psychology of the collective, its personal threat assessment drowned out by the shared excitement of the group. This is when orcs charge gun lines and attack titans on foot and perform acts that their individual nervous systems, without the mob behind them, might have hesitated over. But in smaller groups, in individual encounters, the individual assessment runs more clearly, and a lone orc that finds itself facing a custodian encounters something that its threat detection system does not have a clean category for. Not because the custodian is simply very large, though they are, but because the custodian radiates something that the orc field picks up as anomalous. That emperor's touch, that psychic warding built into what the custodian is, creates a signature in the psychic environment that does not match the hierarchy the field is designed to read. It is not the dominant signal of a bigger orc. It is not the absence of psychic signature of a mundane non-orc opponent. It is something different in kind. Something that the field's ordinary processing does not generate a confident output for. The result is not fear. Orcs don't really do fear, in the sense of behavioral inhibition triggered by threat assessment. But there is something, a hesitation, a fractional pause in the normal, immediate engagement cycle. Something that, if you could ask the orc to articulate it, would probably come out as approximately, "This one is different, and I'm not sure exactly what to do with that yet." In isolation, without the mob to override this assessment, that hesitation matters. It influences how the encounter develops. Combined with the structural factors of where custodians are and how rarely orcs encounter them, it contributes to a pattern where the orc population's attention does not orient specifically toward the 10,000, even when the orcs are operating at significant scale. There is also a simpler availability factor. Orcs fight what they find. They are opportunistic in their violence, drawn toward whatever presents itself as a viable target rather than toward specific chosen objectives, the way a more strategically sophisticated military might plan a campaign. An orc warband on the move goes where fighting is. Fighting is wherever the warband happens to be advancing through. And the custodians are, structurally, almost never where the orc warband is advancing through a detail we will explore in depth when we discuss the geography of this relationship. Section 5. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, when the Emperor led 1,000 against 100,000. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 contains one documented moment that serves as the clearest possible statement about what happens when custodians and orcs actually engage in organized combat. It does not receive the attention it deserves, possibly because its numbers are so overwhelming that they function almost as a summary rather than a narrative. The outcome is the story, and it needs no dramatic embellishment to land. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, late in the Great Crusade, somewhere in the 900 seconds of the 30th millennium. An Orc warlord named Garkul Blackfang had assembled a force powerful enough to present a genuine strategic crisis, not merely a dangerous warband to be handled by a local garrison, not even a crusade to be managed by a single legion, but something that demanded a response commensurate with its threat. 3 full Space Marine legions were deployed to deal with it. The Luna Wolves under Horus, the most beloved and trusted of the Primarchs, the War Master-to-be, at the height of his loyalty and his power. The Death Guard under Mortarion, a warrior who had survived conditions that killed everything around him and built a legion in his image. The Imperial Fists under Rogel Dorn, perhaps the most gifted defensive strategist in the entire Primarch lineage, and formidable in offense as well. 3 Primarchs, 3 full legions, a combined military force that represented hundreds of thousands of Space Marines with all their logistics and orbital support. They were losing, not merely struggling with unexpectedly high casualties, not merely making slower progress than expected against a tough opponent. The accounts are clear. 3 of the most capable generals in the Imperium, with 3 of its greatest armies, were on the verge of being broken by the Orc horde under Blackfang's command. Whatever this warlord had assembled, whatever the scale and composition of his forces, it was sufficient to push the combined might of 3 Primarchs to the edge of defeat. The Emperor watched from the Bucephalus, his golden flagship holding orbit above the world. And then he descended, not with orders transmitted through the Vox network, not with additional reserves of ordinary troops to reinforce the line, personally. With 1,000 warriors of the Legio Custodes at his side, the single largest deployment of the 10,000 ever documented in the known history of the Order. The sources are explicit on this point. More than 1,000 Custodians have never been seen together in one place and time in all of Imperial history, with this battle as the sole documented exception. The significance of that ceiling being reached here, against the Orks, in this specific engagement, is worth noting. The Emperor went for the warlord directly, scaling the Gargant, that enormous, engine-driven war fortress of metal and weaponry that represents the Orc warboss's ultimate statement of personal power, and killed Blackfang atop it. In Orc culture, the killing of a warboss on his own flagship war machine is the most definitive possible statement of hierarchy. The field that Blackfang was sustaining, the force that had unified and amplified the Horde, broke with his death. Simultaneously, the 1,000 Custodians swept into the surrounding Horde. The numbers from the primary sources stated plainly, within what the accounts describe as moments, over 100,000 Orcs were dead. The Horde that had pushed 3 legions and 3 Primarchs to the breaking point was not defeated, not pushed back, not broken and routed. It was eliminated. The casualties among the Emperor's Guard? 3 Custodians, out of 1,000, in an engagement against over 100,000 Orcs who had already proven capable of devastating 3 Space Marine legions. The Emperor's response to those 3 losses tells you more about how he valued his Guard than any passage of lore could. He had their names engraved on his own power armor, not on a plaque in the Hall of Remembrance, not on a monument in the palace grounds, on the armor he wore into battle himself, carried on his own body, present with him in every subsequent engagement, a permanent and intimate memorial to what was lost. 3 names, among the billions who died in the Emperor's wars, inscribed on his armor. The ratio from Gyros Thravian 100,000 Orcs to 3 Custodians is the lore's definitive statement about the relationship between these 2 forces in organized combat. A casualty exchange rate of approximately 33,000 to 1. In any other military context, this number would be treated as a misprint or a propaganda claim. In the Warhammer universe, where the sources are generally precise about these figures, and where the numbers serve as direct statements of the power hierarchy, these are the documented facts of how the encounter proceeded. And note the context. The Orc force at Gyros Thravian was large enough, powerful enough, and unified enough under a dominant warlord that it had nearly broken 3 full legions. That means the psychic field was running at significant power. That means the individual Orcs were amplified by their collective energy into something meaningfully more dangerous than isolated warriors would be. It still made no difference when the Custodians arrived. The Battle of Gyros Thravian is not described in the lore as exceptional. It is described as the expected consequence of the forces involved meeting on the battlefield. And that expectation, that normalizing of these numbers, is itself the most important thing the battle tells us about why Orks and Custodians exist in the relationship they do. Section 6. The War of the Beast, the largest Ork crusade in history. The War of the Beast is one of the most significant events in Warhammer 40,000 lore, and it is less famous than it should be, partly because it sits in the long shadow of the Horus Heresy on one side and the apocalyptic events of the late 41st millennium on the other. It happened in the 32nd millennium, roughly 1,000 years after the heresy, in a period sometimes called the Forging, and its historical footprint is concentrated in the 12-novel Beast Arises series and scattered references in other texts. But for anyone seriously interested in the Ork as a faction, it is essential, because it represents the closest the greenskin race has ever come to achieving what their biology theoretically makes possible: genuine, sustained, galaxy-wide unification under a single dominant intelligence. In 544 M32, something unprecedented emerged from what had looked like ordinary Ork crusade activity. The Imperium's intelligence networks, which are extensive and sophisticated across most of human space, had almost entirely failed to anticipate what was coming. The signs, in retrospect, were the size of various crusade fleets, the unusual coordination between what seemed like separate warbands, the scale of industrial activity on certain Ork-controlled worlds. But the assembled picture did not resolve into a clear threat assessment until the thing itself arrived, which is usually too late. An Ork entity referred to only as the Beast had accomplished something no Ork before it had managed at this scale. It had unified enormous portions of the Ork race into a single coherent military command, not through diplomacy or coalition building, but through the simple and final logic of Ork biology. The Beast was so large, the psychic field it generated so overwhelming, the dominance signal it broadcast through that field so absolute, that Orks within range of it had no capacity to resist the pull of the hierarchy it represented. They gathered around it. They fought under its direction, not because they agreed to, but because the field told them this was the biggest Ork and their biology did the rest. The crusade that resulted was the largest in recorded galactic history, surpassing any previous Ork campaign, dwarfing even the Ullanor crusade that had been the justification for elevating Horus to War Master. Planetary systems were not merely invaded, they were consumed entirely. The Imperium's response escalated repeatedly, and repeatedly proved insufficient. The Imperial Fist chapter, one of the most storied and venerable in existence, was destroyed as a fighting force, reduced to a single survivor named Corland, who would later hold together the entire Imperial response through sheer force of will and necessity. Multiple other chapters suffered catastrophic losses. The strategic situation deteriorated continuously rather than stabilizing. The Beast itself was eventually clarified to be not a single entity, but a collection of 6 prime Orks, hyper-evolved beyond anything in the ordinary Ork hierarchy, each commanding a legion equivalent of greenskins. The collective field generated by 6 prime Orks working in concert was so powerful that it was visibly evolving the ordinary Orks serving under them in real time. Common boys growing to knob dimensions, knobs approaching warboss scale, the entire biological distribution of the species shifting upward as the field amplified the growth mechanism for every individual within its range. When the Imperial counteroffensive eventually reached Ullanor and encountered one of the Prime Orks directly, the Space Marines sent to engage it initially mistook it for a statue. Not a small statue, a 10-meter construct of battle armor, enclosing what turned out to be a living creature of that scale, which only revealed itself to be animate when it began to move toward them. The Beast of Beasts, the largest of the 6 prime Orks, was described as comparable in size to a hab block, with tusks the size of tree trunks. The strategic achievement of the Crusade was extraordinary by any measure. An Ork attack moon, an artificial satellite weapon constructed using technology so advanced that the Adeptus Mechanicus could not identify its operating principles, was positioned in orbit over Terra itself. The throne world of humanity was under direct threat of orbital destruction. An Ork ambassador, one of the evolved prime Ork types, capable of speaking fluent Gothic, presented himself at the court of the High Lords of Terra, and delivered an ultimatum demanding humanity's surrender. During all of this, the direct threat to Terra, the attack moon in orbit, the largest Ork crusade in galactic history, consuming system after system, the Custodians stood their watch. They remained at the Golden Throne. The defense of the Imperium at large was conducted by the Adeptus Astartes, the Astra Militarum, and the desperate alliance of Imperial Fist's successor chapters, assembled by Courland. The 10,000 were not the primary force response. This is documented in the lore analysis of the Beast Arises series, and it is noted somewhat uncomfortably. Despite everything happening, the Custodians maintained their post. Why? The Custodian mandate, as the Order had interpreted it for the 1,000 years since the heresy, was absolute in its focus. Guard the Emperor, guard the Golden Throne, guard the physical location and physical person that, if lost, meant every other victory was meaningless. Every Custodian deployed elsewhere was one fewer at the one place that absolutely could not fall. And the calculus of their irreplaceability, each one a unique creation of the Emperor's own work, not reproducible through any surviving process, made even small losses in distant theaters feel like serious depletion of an ultimately finite and extraordinary resource. And the Orks, even at the height of their greatest mobilization, even with Terra directly threatened, did not specifically orient their aggression toward the 10,000. The attack moon threatened from orbit. The ambassador challenged the political structure. The crusade aimed at humanity as a civilization. The 10,000 golden figures standing inside the walls of the city under threat were not the specific target. Section 7. The Geometry of Absence. Why Orks simply cannot reach the Custodians. Let's step back from the grand historical scale and address something structural, because one of the most practically important reasons why Orks and Custodians don't regularly fight each other is not philosophical or psychological. It is geographical. For the majority of the 10,000 years between the Horus Heresy and the Era Indomitus, the Adeptus Custodes did not leave Terra as an organization. Individual Custodians might venture beyond the palace, on specific assigned missions, the Blood Games, which are exercises where Custodians attempt to breach their own defenses, sometimes require assignments that range outside the immediate complex. The intelligence network maintained by the Custodian Order placed operatives across the Sol system and beyond. Specific enforcement or diplomatic missions dispatched individual warriors where their presence was required. But as a fighting force, as an army, as the concentrated military capability that they theoretically represent, they garrisoned Terra. Terra, however, is not simply a planet with some guards on it. Terra is the most heavily defended location in the known galaxy, protected by concentric rings of military infrastructure, so deep that penetrating to the planet's surface requires defeating every layer of defense in succession. The Imperial Palace covers a significant fraction of the planet's landmass. Its walls rise for kilometers. Its defense batteries engage threats in orbit. The solar fleet controls the space approaches to the system. Mechanicus forces hold the moons. The Astra Militarum regiments, specifically assigned to the palace, number in the millions. The Sisters of Silence maintain anti-psychic fields that would disrupt the Ork psychic field within their operational range. The palace's own Lucifer Blacks and specialist infantry regiments provide layered ground defense before any attacker reaches the Custodian precincts. An Ork force intent on fighting the Custodians would first need to fight through all of that, not as a single engagement, but as a sustained campaign against defenses designed specifically to exhaust exactly this kind of assault. And even if a force somehow reached the inner precincts of the palace, it would face the Custodians on ground that the Custodians know with absolute intimacy, ground that has been analyzed and prepared and defended for 10,000 years by the finest military minds the Imperium has. The probability mathematics are also simply overwhelming. Total Custodian numbers at any given time are approximately 10,000. This is the maximum the creation process can sustain. Of those, a meaningful fraction are always serving the innermost functions. The 300 companions who guard the Emperor directly, the Shadow Keepers managing their contained horrors, the Aphoroi serving as intelligence operatives in the field. The number available for active deployment at any given moment is a small fraction of 10,000. Against this, the orc population of the galaxy is essentially uncountable. Every world the orcs have ever touched continues to produce new orcs from spores in the soil. Every system ever invaded carries the biological legacy of that invasion in its planet's ecologies. Estimates from Imperial xenobiologists are so large that they become meaningless as specific numbers. Call it billions. The actual figure is almost certainly higher. This many orcs filling the entire galaxy produces a probability of any given orc encountering any given custodian in the ordinary course of events that approaches zero from the mathematics alone, regardless of any other factor. The post-Guilliman period shifts this somewhat. With the Custodians now deploying more actively across the galaxy, Trajan Valoris leading strike forces against specific emerging threats, participating in the Indomitus Crusade, ranging beyond Terra in ways unprecedented since the Great Crusade, the intersection of these two populations has become more frequent. Valoris himself led a preemptive strike against Crusade Crushfist before it could achieve dangerous scale. Specific engagements between Custodian forces and Orc warbands have occurred in the current era with greater frequency than in the preceding millennia. But even now, the numbers are what they are. A small elite force deployed against specific high-priority targets is not equivalent to a sustained military presence in the theaters where the green tide is most active. The Orcs pour into 1,000 fronts simultaneously. The Custodians appear at specific, carefully chosen points. The probability of any individual Orc warband encountering a Custodian strike force, rather than the Space Marines or Astra Militarum units that are present in far greater numbers across far greater territory, remains low by the mathematics of scale. The absence is self-reinforcing. The Orcs do not orient toward Custodians, because Custodians are almost never where the Orcs are going. And because they are almost never encountered, they do not accumulate the kind of threat profile in Orc collective biology that would make them a sought target rather than an occasional discovered obstacle. Section 8. The Psychic Dimension. What the Emperor's touch does against the green field. There is a dimension to this question that lives below the surface of all the physical and structural analysis, and it deserves its own careful examination, the psychic one. Specifically, what happens when the Orc collective field, one of the most powerful psychic forces in the galaxy, meets something that carries the Emperor's own power? The Orc psychic field operates, as we discussed, as a collective consciousness, not unified, not directed, but emergent. It reads its environment constantly, evaluating for threats, for hierarchy, for the information the Orc needs to navigate its social world and its military world simultaneously. This evaluation is continuous and largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. It simply happens, the way digestion happens, as an automatic function of what the Orc is. What it is reading for, primarily, is power in the Orc sense, physical size, physical dominance, the hierarchy signal that tells every Orc where every other Orc ranks, the threat magnitude of opponents. It has been running this evaluation for millions of years, long enough that it is very good at what it was designed to do within its designed parameters. The Custodians carry something that is outside those parameters. The Emperor's warding that spark of his own greatness that the lore treats as a real and physical property of every Custodian's existence creates a psychic signature that the Orc field cannot straightforwardly categorize. It is not the dominant signal of a larger Orc. It is not the psychic absence that inert, non-psychic opponents present. It is a positive presence, something that actively radiates in the psychic environment, but in a mode that the Orc field was not tuned to evaluate. Its origin is the Emperor's own power, and the Emperor's psychic nature is of a kind so different from anything the Old Ones built the Orc field to interface with, that the encounter produces something like an error in the field's processing. Not a recognized threat. Not a recognized anything. An anomaly. The Orc Weird Boys are the most sensitive indicators of this effect. Weird Boys function as the Orc field's most direct interface. They channel the collective energy through their individual nervous systems, using it as a directed weapon. But the amplification works both ways. They also receive the field's signal most intensely, including any disruptions or anomalies the field encounters. A Weird Boy near a Custodian would be receiving a signal that does not fit the ordinary patterns the field generates. Whether this produces observable behavioral effects or merely adds to the weird boy's general instability is a question the lore does not answer with precision, but the logical implication is that the presence of something carrying the Emperor's power is not a neutral event for the most field-sensitive orcs in the vicinity. At the level of direct combat, the Emperor's warding also has an interesting implication for how the orc field's amplification works. The field amplifies orc attacks by pushing at the physics of the encounter, bending probability slightly toward orc success, adjusting the quantum behavior of matter in ways that make impacts more effective, making blades feel sharper than their edge alone would justify. This amplification requires the field to interface with the physical processes of the attack and the target. The Custodian's warding is, in some sense, a competing psychic influence in exactly the space where the orc field is trying to operate. When the field tries to push a bolt round toward a lethal impact and the warding pushes back against that probability adjustment, the result is not necessarily that the warding wins absolutely. These are not simple binary outcomes, but the resistance is real. The amplification the orc field provides against Custodians is likely reduced compared to what it achieves against targets without that psychic protection. The marginal cases, the shots and cuts that in another target would be decisive, but that the warding deflects or diminishes, accumulate into a pattern of resilience that exceeds even what the Oromite armor alone would explain. This is speculative, where the lore is not explicit, but the pattern is consistent and the mechanism is coherent. The orc field and the Emperor's touch are not simply different magnitudes of the same kind of force. They are different kinds of force, originating from fundamentally different sources, operating on different principles. When they meet, the meeting is not a clean comparison, but a complex interaction that favors the thing carrying the older and deeper power. Section 9. What happens when they do fight? The math and the stories. For all the structural and psychological factors that keep orcs and Custodians largely separated, they do occasionally meet. History and lore together give us a picture of what those meetings produce. Gyros Thravian is the definitive reference point. 1,000 Custodians, 100,000 orcs, 3 Custodian casualties. We have discussed this at length, but the numbers at the grand scale are worth grounding in the individual capability comparisons that explain why the grand-scale numbers are what they are. A Custodian guard at baseline, the rank-and-file starting point of the 10,000, enters combat as follows. 9 feet of transhuman physiology honed across centuries of training. Oromite armor that exceeds Space Marine plate in physical protection and adds refraction field generators on top. A Guardian spear that can hew through the armor of a Chaos Space Marine and firebolt rounds with precision simultaneously. The kata fighting systems, allowing seamless transitions between hundreds of fighting approaches as the situation develops. The Emperor's warding as an active psychic protection against incoming attacks. This is the baseline. This is what the most junior Custodian brings. Against this, place the standard Orc Boy, a genuine threat to most things in the galaxy. Against ordinary humans, overwhelming. Against a Space Marine, individually outmatched but not trivially so, capable of killing Marines through numbers and the field amplification and getting fortunate on a specific shot or blow. Against a Custodian, the weapons the boy is carrying do not achieve meaningful penetration of Oromite at practical angles. The Custodian's speed means most swings are connecting with empty space where the Custodian was a moment ago. The Guardian spear operating against an Orc boy is, functionally, a butcher's tool rather than a military contest. For orcs to genuinely threaten a Custodian, you need very large numbers. Not dozens, not hundreds, but the kind of scale where the psychic field is running at maximum output, where the physical press of bodies creates tactical problems that cannot be solved through individual combat superiority alone, where attrition through sheer quantity becomes relevant regardless of the individual exchange rate. A crusade of millions, with the field at full power, is a qualitatively different challenge from a warband of thousands. The Orc war boss is where the comparison becomes genuinely interesting rather than simply lopsided. A war boss, at the apex of the Orc hierarchy, 10 feet tall, the product of decades or centuries of successful combat, possibly augmented with bionic improvements by a capable pain boy, armored in mega armor, that represents the Ork equivalent of Terminator plate, carrying a power claw that can shear tank armor with directed force. This is an entity operating in a different tier from the ordinary warrior. The physical size gap between a prime war boss and a custodian has largely closed or reversed. The claw can engage the Oromite at force levels that threaten the armor. The war boss's accumulated combat experience, while not equivalent to kata training, represents real battlefield intelligence applied effectively. A fight between a shield captain and a formidable war boss is not predetermined by the statistics. The custodian retains real advantages: the kata flexibility, the emperor's warding, the precision and integrated reach of the guardian spear. But the war boss's advantages are also real. The physical intensity of something grown through centuries of combat, the psychic amplification of whatever horde surrounds it, the Ork's biologically reinforced refusal to be stopped by injuries that would interrupt any other combatant. The deep irony of the Ork biology in this context is worth dwelling on. Orks grow through combat. A lineage of Orks with multi-generational history of fighting custodians specifically would, over time, trend towards something tailored to that specific challenge. The biological engine is literally designed for this kind of escalating calibration. But the encounters are too rare, and the early stages of this theoretical adaptation process are too reliably fatal for the cycle to complete. The Ork, who could eventually become the perfect custodian fighter, does not survive the early fights long enough to grow into the thing the later fights would produce. The evolutionary potential is there. The opportunity to express it is not. Section 10. The Greater Picture. Two ancient creations, one galaxy, and what it all means. Pull far enough back, and the relationship between Orks and custodians becomes a lens through which you can see something about the Warhammer 40,000 setting that is usually stated more dramatically, but is rarely stated this clearly. This is a universe of ancient designs. Almost nothing in it is accidental. The Orks were engineered by a civilization 60 million years dead. The custodians were personally crafted by the most powerful human being who ever lived. The Chaos Gods emerged from the psychic weight of living minds over billions of years of sentient suffering. The Necrons made their bargain with the Cetan in an age so remote it might as well be mythological. Every major faction is the product of choices made by beings who had purposes and agendas and capabilities that shaped the current galaxy as surely as any geological force shapes a planet's surface. The Custodians are what the Emperor made when he tried to create the best warrior humanity could become. Not a mass-produced template, not a legion-size force to project power across a galaxy. 10,000 individuals, each one a personal work, each one carrying something of what he was. They exist at the center of everything human. They guard the most important single point in the civilization. They are the Emperor's answer to the question of what cannot be allowed to fall. The Orks are what the Old Ones made when they needed a weapon that could never be exhausted. Not a standing army, not a force that could be defeated through attrition and logistics and the ordinary mechanics of warfare. A species, a self-sustaining, self-replicating ecosystem of war that would fight for as long as anything existed to fight against, that would seed any world it touched with the material for future Orks, that was built from the start to be ineradicable. They exist everywhere. They are the Old Ones' answer to the question of what an inexhaustible weapon looks like. These two things, the focused perfection of the Emperor's personal guard and the endless distributed resilience of the Old Ones' war species, pass near each other in the galaxy's geography without often meeting directly. Not because of conspiracy or strategy on either side, because of the shape of what each of them is. The Custodians are concentrated at the center. The Orks fill the periphery and the middle ground and every corner of available space. The Custodians' power is measured in individual capability without parallel. The Orks' power is measured in numbers and persistence without limit. These are qualities that do not naturally intersect. One is a scalpel, the other is a tide. When they do intersect, the outcome confirms the hierarchy. Gyros Thravian's numbers are not a historical anomaly. They are the honest expression of what happens when the Emperor's most personal creation meets the Old One's most resilient one at the level of direct individual combat. The Custodian wins by margins that strain the language of military reporting. The Ork loses in ways that its biology refuses to treat as permanent. because loss is merely the condition before the next growth. And the galaxy continues. The Ork doesn't seek out the Custodian, not because it fears them, not because it has made a strategic calculation, not because it has been warned off by some collective memory of Gyros Thravian burning in the psychic field. The Ork doesn't seek out the Custodian because the Custodian is not where the Ork goes. The Custodian is behind the most defended walls in history, at the center of the most protected location in human space, guarding the one thing that the Ork neither understands nor cares about. The Ork goes where there are things to fight. There are always things to fight. There are always other things to fight. The Golden Warriors at the center of the human fortress are, in the vast calculation of Ork priorities, a very small and very distant concern. And in that distance, in that incidental separation, there is something that almost functions as one of this universe's rare, quiet moments. The tide goes elsewhere. The guard holds the door. The Emperor breathes through his machines. The spores settle into the soil of 1,000 seeded worlds. The war continues, as it always has, and as it always will. And somewhere in the grim darkness of the far future, in a briefing room or a tavern or a foxhole on a world that has seen too many wars, someone asks the question, why don't Orks fight Custodians? And now you know. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of question that rewards sitting with it slowly, and you sat with it all the way through. Drop a like if you enjoyed this. It makes a real difference in helping others find content like this, and this is made for exactly the kind of person who went the distance. Subscribe if you haven't. There is so much more to explore in this universe, questions like this one, hiding in the lore where most people don't look, waiting for someone to stop and actually ask them. I intend to find them all. Leave a comment. Tell me what you thought. Tell me what aspect of this you want to go deeper on. Tell me the question you've been sitting with that you haven't heard a good answer to yet. I read everything. Until next time. End of script. Extended section. The Emperor's Golden Legion. What the 10,000 truly represent. To understand fully why the Orks don't orient toward the Custodians as a target, we need to spend more time with what the Custodians actually mean to the Imperium, beyond their battlefield capability. Because the Custodians are not simply very powerful warriors. They are a statement, a declaration, an institution so laden with meaning that the meaning itself shapes how they function and how they are perceived. The Adeptus Custodes were called the 10,000 for most of their history, a name that originated as an approximation of their total numbers in the Great Crusade era, and became a cognomen so thoroughly attached to them that it persists, regardless of whether the literal count has always matched. The name carries weight beyond numerology. It says, we are finite, we are rare, we are precious. There are 10,000 of us, and there will never be significantly more, and each one of us is worth more than we can easily quantify. This sense of their own irreplaceability shapes the Custodian's psychology in ways that differ from every other military organization in the Imperium. Space Marine chapters lose brothers in combat and mourn them and replace them through the recruitment and training of new initiates. The cycle of loss and renewal, sustaining the chapter's strength across generations. The Adeptus Mechanicus loses Scitarii and produces more. The Astra Militarum treats individual soldiers as essentially fungible, tragic in human terms, but operationally necessary at the scale of a million-world civilization. Even Space Marines, for all their reverence for the fallen, operate within a system designed to absorb their losses. The Custodians cannot do this. The process that makes a Custodian is irreproducible without the Emperor's personal involvement, and the Emperor has been interred on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. The knowledge he carried, the specific artistry he applied to each individual warrior's creation, cannot be replicated by any surviving technique. Each Custodian who dies is not replaced. The pool of 10,000, already a smaller number than most people instinctively appreciate, has only shrunk since the heresy. The companions who guard the innermost sanctums of the palace are not merely elite soldiers. They are a finite and diminishing resource that the entire civilization depends on in ways that go beyond their battlefield function. This irreplaceability is the deepest reason why the Custodians have historically been so reluctant to deploy beyond Terra. Every deployment risks losses. Every loss is permanent. And the function they serve, guarding the Emperor, maintaining the integrity of the Golden Throne, ensuring that the Astronomicon continues to burn, is so foundational to everything else the Imperium does that the cost-benefit calculus for risking Custodians in field operations is extraordinarily unfavorable compared to the PA calculus that applies to any other military asset. Against this background, the Ork Tide presents an interesting problem. The Green Tide is the kind of threat that Space Marine chapters and Astra Militarum regiments are designed to handle. It is vast, it is distributed, it requires sustained presence across large theaters of operation, and it rewards the ability to absorb attrition over long campaigns, all characteristics that the Custodians are poorly suited to address. 1,000 Custodians can do what 100,000 Space Marines might struggle to do in a specific location in a specific engagement, as Gyros Thravian demonstrates. But 1,000 Custodians cannot hold 100 contested systems simultaneously over the course of years. The kind of war the Orks fight, the kind of presence the Ork threat demands, is not the kind of war the Custodians exist to win. The Custodians are the last line, not the front line. They are the answer to the question of what happens after everything else has already failed. They are what stands at the center when the periphery has been overrun. This is not a strategic choice made by individual Custodians weighing options. It is the consequence of everything that the Order is its rarity, its function, its relationship to the Emperor's own survival. And the Orks, for all their capacity to threaten the periphery and the middle ground, and occasionally even the approaches to the center, almost never produce threats that specifically require what the Custodians offer. Almost, the War of the Beast, came close, truly close. An attack moon over Terra, the capacity to destroy the throne world, the theoretical possibility that the Custodians might eventually have to fight for the Emperor's physical chamber against a green tide of evolved prime Orks. And even then, the threat was addressed through other means before it came to that. The Custodians, watching these close calls from the center of the storm, carry a particular kind of quiet that comes from 10,000 years of vigil. They have watched the Imperium weather catastrophe after catastrophe, each time surviving by narrower margins, each time requiring more of the forces that defend it. They have watched the Emperor's power slowly dim on the Golden Throne, the light of the Astronomicon that was once bright and certain, now flickering at the edges. They have watched, and they have held, and the Orks have never quite reached them, not because the Orks couldn't, in theory, not because the galaxy's green tide has lacked the raw numbers or the destructive potential to threaten even the most fortified position in human space, but because the structure of Ork aggression, the way the green tide flows toward available targets rather than chosen ones, has directed it elsewhere. Because the distance between where Orks naturally go and where Custodians naturally are has proven, across 10,000 years of history, wider than the Ork tide has managed to fully close. That distance is not absolute. The era Indomitus has brought the Custodians further out into the galaxy than they have ranged since the Great Crusade, and the Orks are, as always, everywhere. The probability of significant engagements between these two forces has increased and will continue to increase. In specific theaters, where Custodian strike forces operate and Ork crusades are active, the battles that result will add new numbers to the historical record and new stories to the accumulated lore. Whether those numbers will match Gyros Thravian's ratio, or whether the evolution of Ork warbands that regularly encounter Custodians will begin to produce something that changes the equation, that is a question the future of the lore will answer. For now, the pattern holds. The Golden Guard holds its post, the green tide fills the galaxy, and the two things most completely made for war, each in its own way, continue their ancient purposes. Extended section. What the Ork sees the view from the green tide. Let's do something slightly unusual for a moment. Let's try to inhabit the Ork's perspective, insofar as that is possible for anyone who has not been through whatever the Ork's neurological experience actually is. An Ork is not stupid exactly, but it is not thinking in the way most of us mean when we use that word. The Ork's cognitive processes are oriented toward the immediate. What is happening right now? What is in front of me right now? What is available to fight, or eat, or steal right now? The future exists for the Ork, primarily as an extension of the present, the next fight, the next moment of conflict, The next opportunity to do the thing that every fiber of its biology is telling it to do constantly and without pause. Abstract planning, the kind that requires holding a picture of many future contingencies and comparing them, does not come naturally to the basic orc. What does come naturally is an exquisitely sensitive, real-time awareness of the environment. Who is around? Who is bigger? Who is dominant? Where the threats are coming from? Where the best fight is happening? The orc reads all of this through the field in a way that is faster and in some ways more accurate than conscious deliberation, because the field has been running this evaluation continuously for the 60 million years of orc evolutionary history and is extremely good at what it does within its domain. When the field evaluates the custodian, here is what it encounters, roughly speaking. Something very large in the physical sense good. The orc registers this as a significant opponent. Something very powerful in the way that the field reads power. The warding, the Emperor's touch, broadcasting in the local psychic environment at a level the field can feel. Something that reads as powerful in a way that does not fit neatly into the ordinary hierarchy, signal the field uses to sort opponents into categories. And something that is radiating a psychic quality that the field has no good framework for, because it is the signature of the Emperor's power. And the Emperor is not an orc, not a human, not any category the old ones built the field to process. The result is an assessment that the field cannot conclude cleanly. Normally, the field produces fast, clear outputs: fight, flee, defer to authority, challenge for dominance. Against the custodian, the output is more like, this is significantly powerful. The nature of that power is unusual. Proceed with the caution appropriate to something you don't have a clean read on. In the presence of the mob, this hesitation disappears, overwhelmed by collective enthusiasm. Alone, it affects behavior in ways that look, from the outside, like an unusual pause in the otherwise immediate orc aggression cycle. The orc is also, at some level below conscious thought, aware of the shape of its own experience with this kind of opponent. Not in the sense of cultural memory or strategic learning, but in the biological sense that organisms are aware of patterns through the feedback of their own functioning. The orc who encountered a custodian before, or rather, the spore descendants of the orc who encountered a custodian before, carrying some chemical imprint of that encounter in their biology, has a slightly different calibration in the specific frequency of threat detection that corresponds to this particular type of opponent. It is not knowledge. It is something more like instinct, shaped by experience, carried through the spore inheritance. This instinct does not produce avoidance. It does not produce what we would recognize as learned fear of the custodian as a category. It produces something more subtle, a slight upward adjustment in the urgency assessment, a slight increase in the threshold before the individual orc commits to an engagement without the mob behind it, a slight preference for finding a better opportunity over pursuing this particular target alone. Not fear, not strategy. An instinct, shaped by biological experience, that treats this type of opponent as one that is better approached in company. Since custodians are found in locations that tend not to have large orc mobs nearby, and since large orc mobs are required to override the individual hesitation, and since the orc's natural movement is toward wherever the big fights already are, rather than toward isolated, unusual opponents, the cycle closes on itself. The orc does not find the custodian because the orc is not looking, and the orc is not looking because the orc has calibrated, at a level below thought, that this particular target is one for another time, when the mob is larger, when the circumstances are better, when the fight would be more satisfying. That other time almost never comes, and that, in the end, is the simplest and most complete answer to the question we started with. Extended section: Gork and Mork versus the Emperor's Light. A theological aside. This is an unusual section for a lore discussion, but it belongs in any complete treatment of this topic, because the orc relationship with cosmic power is not entirely secular. The orcs have gods. Gork and Mork are as real as any entities in the Warhammer pantheon, real in the specific sense that they exist, that they have power, that they can manifest in the material universe in ways that have effects. They are not metaphors or cultural inventions. They are genuine psychic entities sustained by the collective belief of the orc race, fed by the same field that makes red vehicles go faster, and capable of occasionally punching through the veil between the immaterium and the material in ways that are visible on battlefields. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The distinction, intensely debated among orcs, is the central theological question of their culture, and the fact that no two orcs agree on which is itself probably a deliberate expression of the gods' joint nature. The difference between them is a philosophical paradox, not a resolvable factual disagreement, and the ongoing debate is itself an act of worship. These gods embody everything the orcs are. They are war and cunning simultaneously, the two virtues of the orc codified into divine form. They receive the energy of the field continuously, growing stronger as more orcs fight and more blood is spilled in their name, and occasionally descending into the material universe through the mechanism of enormous walking idols called gargants, constructed by mech boys in the image of their gods and animated by the field's power. The Emperor, from the orcs' theological perspective insofar as orcs have a theological perspective on the Emperor, which is indirect and mostly expressed as recognizing that the gold-armored beings they sometimes encounter are of a different order from ordinary enemies, is not categorized as a god in the orc sense. The Emperor's power is not the kind that the orc field interacts with cleanly, not the kind that feeds into Gork or Mork, or acknowledges their domain. It is something external to the orc's cosmic framework, something that exists in the theological landscape the same way the auramite of custodian armor exists in the physical landscape. Not hostile, not part of the system, simply not legible to the tools the system provides. This theological incommensurability contributes to the orcs' unusual experience of the custodians, the gods that orcs turn to for strength and guidance in battle, the psychic connection to Gork and Mork that every orc maintains through the field, offers no useful information about how to relate to something that carries the Emperor's mark. It is outside the frame. Gork and Mork know violence and cunning, expressed within the orc's own domain of existence. What the Emperor is, in the psychic architecture of this galaxy, the animus of humanity's collective will, the beacon in the immaterium, the being who holds the warp at bay from a dying throne of gold, is simply not something the twin gods have a position on. In a universe where divine backing is itself a form of tactical intelligence, where the Khorne-favored warrior fights differently, knowing Khorne is watching, where the Nurgle-blessed soldier is genuinely protected by their god's attention, the orc fighting a custodian is fighting without the usual divine reference point. The field provides. The gods are absent from this encounter in a specific way. Not indifferent, they don't have a position. The Emperor's light is simply outside the domain Gork and Mork govern. This does not make the custodian an enemy that the orc fears at a theological level. Fear, again, is not well supported by orc neurology, but it contributes to the sense of encountering something outside the ordinary categories, something that the orc's entire cognitive and spiritual framework does not have a pre-prepared response to. And that sense of being outside the categories, combined with all the structural and geographical factors we have discussed, is the final piece of why the orc tide flows elsewhere, and the Golden Guard holds their post, and the question we started with has the answer it has. Closing reflection. The meaning of the gap. There is something worth sitting with, after all of this, about what the gap between orcs and custodians means for the setting as a whole. Not as a tactical or strategic observation, but as a statement about the universe itself. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting defined by overwhelming scale and perpetual crisis. Its defining aesthetic is the impossibility of the situation. Too many enemies, too few defenders, too little time, too limited resources, against foes that don't stop and don't negotiate, and don't acknowledge the legitimacy of human survival. The only reason the Imperium persists is because it has not yet met the version of these overwhelming circumstances that proves finally fatal, not because anyone has found a way to win, in any stable sense, against the forces arrayed against humanity. In this context, the relationship between the orcs and the custodians represents something unusual. Two of the most extreme expressions of the setting's power hierarchy passing near each other without often directly colliding. The green tide that fills the galaxy, and the Golden Guard that holds the center, each doing what it was made to do, without particularly orienting toward the other, and by that non-orientation, existing in a strange equilibrium. This equilibrium is not permanent. The expansion of custodian deployments in the current era, the increasing scale and organization of Orc crusades under warlords like Ghazghkull Thraka, the general deterioration of the Imperium's defensive buffers across the galaxy, all of these factors are slowly increasing the probability of significant, sustained contact between these two forces in ways that historical patterns do not predict. The future lore, whatever it holds, will eventually explore what happens when the gap closes further. But for now, and for most of the history the setting encompasses, the gap persists. And in that gap in the space between the Orcs' tide and the Custodians' post, you can see something that the setting rarely shows explicitly. Not victory, not resolution, not the moment when the balance tips definitively one way or the other, but persistence. The stubborn, grinding, unglamorous fact of survival in a universe that does not want you to survive. The Orcs persist because they were made to persist, because 60 million years of feral evolution has honed a biological weapon into something that the galaxy cannot eradicate, regardless of effort or intention. The Custodians persist because they were made to guard, and they have guarded, through 10,000 years of the Emperor's dying, with a fidelity that the word loyalty is too small to contain. Neither of them is winning, neither of them is losing. Both of them are doing what they were made to do, in a galaxy that continues in spite of everything to burn. And somewhere in that burning, quietly, the gold meets the green, and the green falls, and the gold walks back through the gate, and the spores settle into the soil, and the question remains open. Why don't Orcs fight Custodians? Because the galaxy is very large, and the Custodians are at the center, and the Orcs are everywhere else. And when they do meet, the result is a number that sounds like a misprint. And because in the 41st millennium, even that number is not enough to change the war. If this found you at the end of a long day, or in the middle of a quiet night, or during whatever small window of peace the universe allowed you today, I hope it was worth the time. This is the kind of lore that rewards sitting with it slowly. I appreciate that you sat with it. Drop a like if this earned one. Subscribe if you want more of this. And leave a comment. Tell me where you watched from. Tell me what resonated. Tell me the next question you want to take apart together. Until next time, the Emperor protects. End of script. Deep dive. The creation of the Custodian. Understanding the process that made them irreplaceable. We have discussed the Custodian creation process in terms of its outcomes, but it deserves examination in its own right. Because understanding the process is essential to understanding why the 10,000 exist in the specific relationship they have with every other faction in the Imperium, including the Orcs. The Emperor, in his pre-imperial life across the thousands of years before the Unification Wars, accumulated knowledge at a rate and depth that no other human being has ever approached. He lived through the rise and fall of civilizations, through technological ages that humanity has since lost and attempts to recover, through philosophical and scientific revolutions that changed the foundations of human understanding multiple times over. By the time he emerged to unite Terra, he understood genetics, psychology, the mechanics of warp interaction, and the deep history of the galaxy at levels that the combined resources of the current Imperium cannot replicate. He applied this understanding to the Custodians first. The Space Marine Legions came later, built on principles derived from the Primarch Project and the Gene Seed system, a system designed to be replicable, to be scalable, to work without the Emperor's personal involvement in each individual case. This was a deliberate compromise. The Space Marine system sacrifices some ceiling of individual capability in exchange for being able to produce hundreds of thousands of effective warriors, without the Emperor needing to give each one personal attention. It works. The legions were extraordinary by any standard that did not compare them to the Custodians directly, but the Custodians were made without that compromise. Each one received what the Emperor could give when he gave it his full attention, the way a master craftsman gives a commissioned masterwork, his full attention, rather than the attention he gives a production run of functional items. The result is something that a standardized process cannot reproduce. Not because the standardized process is bad at what it does, but because what it does is by design different from what the Emperor did when he built the Custodians. This distinction manifests in several ways that are directly relevant to the Orc question. Custodians are not merely stronger or faster than Space Marines, in the way that one excellent product might be somewhat better than another excellent product in the same line. They are different in kind, different the way a hand-carved instrument is different from a factory-produced one, even if both play the same notes. The difference is in the specificity of the calibration, the depth of the integration between the biological and the psychological and the psychic elements of what they are. A custodian's training, conducted over centuries by an organization with no replacement pressure and no timeline pressure, is calibrated to that specific individual. The kata fighting systems are not a curriculum that all custodians learn identically. They are adapted to each warrior's physical and psychological profile, refined across their service life in response to their specific experiences, adjusted as their capabilities develop. Two custodians, standing side by side in the same armor, carrying the same weapons, have nevertheless been trained into their warrior identities through processes as individual, as the bodies those identities inhabit. This individuality is visible in how custodians operate in combat. Unlike Space Marines, who train extensively in coordinated squad tactics and whose battlefield effectiveness is significantly enhanced by the close cooperation of brothers fighting together, custodians are described as operating as individuals, even when fighting in groups. Their squad assignments are flexible. Custodians shift between different formations before campaigns, working with different partners depending on the requirements of the mission, without the long-term paired training that makes Space Marine squad cohesion so effective. Each custodian trusts that their companion is an entity of sufficient individual capability, that close coordination training is less essential than simply knowing that the being next to them is competent to handle their own immediate combat zone. This individualism is both a strength and a limitation. A single custodian breaking a charging horde by themselves is the expression of this strength, the individual operating at their maximum, without any dependency on support, without any coordination cost, pure individual capability, applied directly to the problem. The limitation appears when the situation requires the kind of coordinated team behavior that only long-term unit cohesion produces. The custodians can and do operate in coordinated ways, but their natural mode is the individual masterwork, not the disciplined ensemble. Against the Orks, this actually plays relatively well. The Ork combat style, which tends toward individual challenges at the high end and mob crushes at the low end, presents situations where individual custodian excellence is directly applicable. The Ork warboss, who charges a custodian, expecting to dominate through personal ferocity, encounters an individual who is operating at the absolute maximum of their specific personal development. The mob that crashes toward a custodian encounters something that can continue fighting effectively, even when surrounded. Because the katas include specific modes for fighting in all directions, simultaneously, against multiple opponents, and the custodian's enhanced awareness gives them the sensory processing bandwidth to maintain that mode indefinitely in a way a more ordinary warrior could not. The places where the Ork style presents problems for the custodian, the enormous numbers, the psychic amplification, the physical press of bodies, are exactly the places where the custodian's individual excellence offers diminishing returns. 10 custodians against 1,000 Orks is a very different problem from one custodian against 100 Orks, because at some scale, the mathematical weight of bodies overcomes what individual capability can address, regardless of how high that individual capability goes. This is why large Ork crusades have historically represented threats that even the finest individual warriors cannot simply solve through direct engagement, and why the custodian's usual strategic response to Ork threats, on the scale where this becomes relevant, is to not be the primary response force at all. Deep dive. 10,000 years of watch. How the Vigil shaped the custodians. The Adeptus Custodes spent 10,000 years doing something that has no real parallel in the experience of any other military organization in the Warhammer setting. They stood vigil, not training for battle while guarding a vulnerable principle, not rotating through combat deployments with garrison duty in between, but specifically and deliberately choosing to remain at one location, performing one function without the relief of action that most warriors depend on to sustain their sense of purpose. This had profound effects on the custodians as an institution and as individuals. The Blood Games are perhaps the most famous expression of how the Custodians managed the psychological toll of the Vigil. In the Blood Games, Custodians attempt to breach the defenses of the Imperial Palace, the defenses they themselves maintain and know intimately. The exercise is intended to identify weaknesses before actual enemies can exploit them, and it works for this purpose. But it also serves a second function that the formal documentation perhaps understates. It gives the Custodians something to do that engages the full range of their capabilities, that presents genuine challenge, that provides the kind of extended problem-solving and adversarial engagement that warriors need to remain effective. A blood game is not a simple exercise. It involves planning, deception, creative problem-finding, and the use of the full repertoire of Custodian skills against one of the most formidable defensive networks in human history. Running a successful blood game is regarded as an exceptional achievement. Running 2, which Trajan Valoris accomplished before becoming Captain General, set a record that remains unbroken. The Shadow Keepers, the Order of Custodians, tasked with maintaining the vaults beneath the palace, where the most dangerous captured entities and artifacts are stored, have their own particular version of this challenge. They guard things that are actively, continuously trying to escape, things that require the constant application of not just physical force but psychic resistance, strategic containment, and knowledge deep enough to anticipate threats that present themselves in forms no ordinary catalog of dangers would list. The Shadow Keepers never lack for engagement in the relevant sense. Their quarry is always active, always probing, always requiring real attention. But for the broader organization, for the Custodians who were performing the ordinary functions of the garrison, the 10,000 years of vigil produced a particular relationship with time that differs from anything most human beings, or even most space marines, develop. Custodians do not experience time the way mortal humans do, who feel each year as a specific experiential weight, who accumulate memories in ways that build into a subjective sense of their own history. The Custodians' relationship with their own past is more like a library than like a narrative, extensive, detailed, accessible, but not experienced as a continuous flow in the way that shorter lives experience time. This relationship with time produces a kind of patience that serves the Custodian in certain ways and fails them in others. The Custodian can hold a strategic commitment across time frames that would be inconceivable for a mortal officer. They can maintain vigilance without the attrition of attention that eventually degrades human alertness under sustained watch. They remember threats that were relevant centuries ago with the same clarity that they remember current ones, giving their intelligence function a depth of historical context that no ordinary human analyst can match. But it can also produce a conservatism, a tendency to rely on the way things have always been done, because the things that have always been done have been tested over enormous timescales and found to work. This conservatism was the source of the institutional resistance to deploying beyond Terra, a resistance that proved very difficult to overcome, even when the arguments for expansion were compelling. The Custodians had been the palace garrison for 10,000 years, and the weight of that unbroken tradition pressed against change, even when change was clearly needed. Trajan Valoris's achievement in shifting this institutional posture, in convincing the 10,000 that their vigil needed to expand in scope, that guarding the Emperor in the new age of the Dark Imperium required engaging threats before they could reach Terra, rather than simply holding the walls, represents one of the more significant internal transformations in the 5 Custodian Orders' history. He did not change what the Custodians are. He changed their understanding of what their purpose requires, which amounts to much the same thing in practice. The consequence for the Ork question is that the post-Vigil Custodians, ranging more freely, encountering Ork forces in the broader galaxy, are bringing those 10,000 years of accumulated patience and strategic depth to bear on a different kind of problem. They are not simply the warriors who hold the final line. They are also, now, the warriors who prevent final lines from being needed, the spear thrust before the shield is raised, the preemptive engagement that prevents a crusade crush fist from becoming the next war of the beast. Whether this is enough, in the long run, to keep the Ork tide from eventually forcing the confrontation that history has mostly avoided, that is the question the current lore leaves open. And open questions are, in the grim darkness of the far future, where all the most important things live. Deep dive. The Ork warlord, as a recurring variable. What the greatest orcs mean for the custodian question. We have discussed orc biology in general terms and the hierarchy that governs orc society, but the specific phenomenon of the orc warlord at its most extreme deserves focused attention, because it is where the orc-custodian relationship becomes most interesting and most contested. The ordinary orc boy, for all the real danger it represents to most things in the galaxy, is not the version of the orc that presents a genuine individual challenge to a custodian. The Nob, larger and more experienced, edges closer to that level, but remains clearly below it in the individual comparison. The Warboss is where the territory becomes genuinely uncertain, and above the Warboss there are entities that push even further. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka is the best-known example of what happens when an orc warlord achieves a level of victory accumulation and psychic enhancement that carries them beyond the ordinary Warboss tier. He is described as so large he was mistaken for an Astartes dreadnought on the battlefield, not a standard dreadnought, which stands 3.7 meters tall and is essentially a walking tank. But still, he has survived having his head disassembled, his blood drained, and his heart stopped and restarted multiple times, courtesy of Mad Doc Grotznick's extreme surgical interventions. He fought Ragnar Blackmane, a Space Wolves Primaris Space Marine, who stands among the finest warriors of his generation, for 10 consecutive days before the fight ended in his decapitation, from which he subsequently recovered. By any reasonable standard, Gazkul, at his current scale, is operating in a tier that individual custodians would need to take seriously. Not necessarily defeat him, not necessarily find the fight straightforward, but seriously. A shield captain engaging Gazkul would not be engaging something that falls clearly below their capability level. They would be engaging something that is in their weight class, different in kind, carrying the amplification of a massive psychic field from millions of orcs behind it, possessed of a physical mass and durability that the katas were not necessarily calibrated against, but genuinely in the contest. And above Gazkul in the historical record stands the Beast, 10 meters tall, wearing armor of a quality that the Adeptus Mechanicus could not identify or understand, speaking fluent Gothic, commanding a psychic field of such intensity that it was evolving the orc species in real time. A being that fought Vulcan, one of the most physically powerful of the Primarchs, a warrior whose durability was legendary, even among beings who were all legendary, to a standstill that required Vulcan's own sacrifice to resolve. A custodian fighting the Beast, had such an encounter occurred during the War of the Beast, would have been a fight at the absolute maximum of what any individual warrior could be called to do. Not necessarily a losing fight, the Emperor's Touch and the Auramite and the Katas are not nothing but a fight where the outcome would have been genuinely uncertain, in ways that most encounters between custodians and orcs are not. This is the version of the orc that the custodian mandate was ultimately built to address if needed, and the fact that the War of the Beast was resolved before that fight happened is perhaps one of the most significant close calls in the history of the relationship between these two forces. The Beast's evolution raises the possibility, which the lore gestures toward without fully developing, of what prime orcs at their historical maximum might represent as a challenge. The Krork, as the ancient ancestors of the modern orc, were described as larger and more technologically sophisticated. If the War of the Beast represented the orc race, beginning to approach something like its ancient form, the field strong enough, the individuals large enough, the technology sophisticated enough to begin recovering what was lost over 60 million years of degradation, then the very largest orc entities might represent a category of challenge that even the custodians would approach as a serious tactical problem rather than a straightforward engagement. This is speculation, taking the lore's hints further than they explicitly go, but it is the honest direction in which the biological logic of the orc points if the conditions that enabled the beast were ever to be replicated at greater scale. For now, the individual orc warboss, even the most formidable one currently active, represents an interesting challenge rather than a genuine threat to an individual custodian in a direct one-on-one. The scale changes dramatically when the warboss has millions of orcs behind it, generating field amplification at maximum, which is why Valoris targets crusades with preemptive strikes, rather than waiting for them to mature into something that requires a different kind of response. The question of what happens if an Ork crusade grows to the scale of the War of the Beast and the Custodians are now present in the field rather than garrisoned on Terra. That is the scenario the current era has not yet produced, but that the trajectory of events makes more conceivable than at any point since the 32nd millennium. Final thoughts. The question that keeps opening. We started with a question that seemed simple. Why don't Orks fight Custodians? And what we found, following it seriously, is that simple questions about complex universes almost never have simple answers. They have structures. They have layers. They have the kind of depth that rewards exactly this kind of slow, attentive examination. Not the surface answer, not the reflexive response, but the full architecture of causes and contexts and consequences that together explain why things are the way they are. The Orks don't fight the Custodians because the Custodians are positioned at the center of the most defended location in the galaxy, behind concentric rings of military infrastructure that any Ork force would have to consume before reaching them. The Orks, for all their aggression, direct their violence toward available targets rather than chosen ones, and the Custodians have historically been the opposite of available. The Orks' own biological assessment tool, the psychic field that reads hierarchy and threat in its environment, encounters something in the Custodian's nature that does not fit its ordinary categories, something that registers as unusual enough to slightly dampen the individual Ork's default immediate engagement impulse. When the forces do meet, the outcome is so consistently and overwhelmingly lopsided that even the Ork spore inheritance carries some chemical echo of the encounter into subsequent generations, not as strategic avoidance, but as biological calibration that slightly orients away from this specific type of opponent. The Custodians' own strategic calculus, especially through most of the post-heresy period, kept them garrisoned rather than engaged, limiting the frequency of encounters and preventing the kind of sustained contact that could have produced Ork evolutionary adaptation to the specific challenge of fighting them. And underlying all of this, the Custodians and the Orks are both exactly what they were made to be. The Ork is the weapon that fills all available space, relentless and self-replicating and impossible to permanently destroy, aimed at everything and therefore not specifically at anything. The Custodian is the guardian at the specific point, focused and irreplaceable and unmatched in direct combat, aimed at nothing except the defense of the one thing that cannot be lost. These two things exist at angles to each other that mean they almost never collide directly, and when they do, the result is lopsided in ways that the universe usually reserves for contact between categories of power that should not be compared at all. The war continues. Both of them are still there. Neither is winning in the sense of making the other less present in the galaxy. And the question, properly understood, is not really about fighting or not fighting. It is about what these two forces represent, and why the shape of the universe has arranged itself in the specific way that keeps them mostly separate. Now you know. Thank you for staying with this all the way through. This is the kind of lore conversation I love most, the one where the question keeps opening up rather than closing down, where every answer reveals 3 more things worth asking about. If this gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see either of these factions even slightly, then it did exactly what I hoped. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want more. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what's next on your mind. Tell me the question you want to take apart together. Until next time, the Emperor protects. End of complete script. The biology of overwhelming Y Ork numbers are not simply a numbers problem. One of the persistent misconceptions about why Orks are difficult to deal with is that the problem is fundamentally mathematical. The thinking goes, there are a lot of Orks, therefore they win through sheer weight of bodies. If you have something capable enough to kill them faster than they arrive, the problem goes away. This framing, which treats the Ork horde as a simple accumulation of individually manageable threats, misses what actually makes large Ork concentrations categorically different from smaller ones. And understanding that difference is essential to understanding why the Custodian solution, as extraordinarily effective as it is at the individual level, does not simply scale upward to resolve the Ork problem at every scale. The Ork Gestalt field, which we have described in terms of its effect on individual orcs and on the technology they operate, has a collective dimension that changes the nature of the problem in ways that purely military thinking does not fully capture. When enough orcs gather in close proximity over a sufficient period of time, estimates vary, but major crusade formations, where the field has been allowed to mature over months or years, the collective psychic output of the horde begins to function as something qualitatively different from an amplified version of individual orc psychic presence. It becomes an environmental condition. This is not metaphor. The warp signatures associated with mature orc crusade formations are detectable by astropaths and navigators at ranges well beyond direct sensor coverage, and they do not simply read as a large number of individual orc signatures scaled up. They read as a single, coherent thing, a psychic entity of sorts, distributed across millions of individual biological nodes, but operating with something approaching unified character. The orc warboss is not merely the strongest individual in this network. They are, in some sense, the focus of it, the point where the distributed psychic output concentrates into directed will. When custodians engage orc crusade formations of this maturity and scale, they are not fighting a large number of orcs. They are fighting within the influence of this field, which affects everything around it. Non-orc allies fighting alongside the custodians are affected by proximity to this psychic mass in ways that range from generalized unease to active combat impairment. The environment itself, terrain, weather systems in some documented cases, even the stability of local warp conditions shows changes consistent with the field's influence. Fighting large orcs is fighting in a place that has been made, in some subtle but real way, into an orc place. For the custodians, whose own connection to the Emperor's will gives them unusual resistance to psychic environmental influence, this is less debilitating than it would be for ordinary military forces. But resistance is not immunity. Even the custodians' enhanced sensory and psychological architecture has limits, and the scale of field produced by a mature orc crusade at its maximum, the kind that threatened Terra during the War of the Beast, operates at levels where resistance begins to be meaningful rather than absolute. This is the version of the orc problem that makes the numbers matter in a different way than simple attrition. It is not that enough orc bodies will eventually exhaust a custodian. Through killing pace, a single custodian's killing pace against orc infantry is high enough that the arithmetic of attrition runs heavily in their favor for absurdly long periods. It is that enough orcs generate and that presents a scale of psychic environmental challenge that eventually becomes relevant even to the most psychically resistant of combatants. This distinction is why Trajan Valoris's current approach, engaging orc crusades in their formation phases, before they reach the maturity that produces the field at its most dangerous, preemptive strikes against the specific concentrations that would generate the next tier of warlord, is strategically sensible at a level beyond simply being aggressive. It is an approach designed specifically to prevent the conditions that make the problem categorically different from arising in the first place. Kill the warlord before the warlord becomes the field focus. Disperse the formation before the formation becomes the environment. Address the threat at the scale where individual custodian excellence applies, rather than allowing it to grow to the scale where the problem changes character. It is, in other words, a strategy built on the understanding that the orcs at their worst are not simply more of what the orcs are at their ordinary level. They are something different in kind, and the only way to avoid facing that difference is to not allow the difference to develop. The other side of the galaxy orc fronts, the custodians do not address. The scope of the orc presence in the galaxy is so vast that any discussion of the custodian relationship to orc forces necessarily involves implicit acknowledgement of the enormous amount of that presence that the custodians simply do not engage with at all. The 10,000, even expanded in their current more active role, number in the thousands rather than the millions. The orc population of the galaxy numbers in, conservatively, the hundreds of billions, spread across hundreds of distinct crusade formations and thousands of smaller warbands and individual worlds, hosting orc settlements in various stages of development. The custodians, who now range beyond Terra, are not attempting to address this entire presence. They could not. Their numbers do not permit it, and their function does not require it. What they address is the specific subset of Ork threats that relate to the defense of the Emperor, the Crusades of a scale that could conceivably reach the Sol system, the warlords who show signs of the kind of development that might produce another entity approaching the beast tier, the formations that threaten the specific supply lines or strategic nodes, whose loss would degrade the Imperium's ability to function as the defense network it is meant to be. The overwhelming majority of Ork threats in the galaxy are handled or not handled by the Astartes, by the Imperial Guard, by the Navy, by the local planetary defense forces that sometimes manage better than anyone expects, and sometimes collapse in ways that no one could have predicted. These forces fight Orks constantly, on dozens of worlds right now. In the eternal present tense of the 41st and 42nd millennia, there are Imperial soldiers dying in green floods, dying in the teeth of Ork machinery that should not function and does anyway, dying under the weight of numbers that none of their strategic planning had fully accounted for. The Custodians are not there for most of that. They are not supposed to be. This is not a failure. It is a function of what the Custodians are and what they are for. But it does mean that for the average Space Marine chapter dealing with an Ork crusade, for the average Guard regiment trying to hold a manufactorum world that 3 warbands have decided to converge on simultaneously, the Custodians represent something that might as well be on another planet entirely, which, usually, they are. There is something worth sitting with in this asymmetry. The greatest individual warriors in the Imperium, the most comprehensively capable close combat fighters that human civilization has ever produced, spend the vast majority of their existence guarding one location, while across the galaxy, the people who most desperately need the kind of help only they could provide never see them. This is not a criticism. The Emperor is what he is, and his preservation is the hinge on which the Imperium's capacity to fight at all depends. But the asymmetry is real, and it shapes the practical relationship between the Custodians and the Orks in ways that the lore does not always foreground. Most Orks will never fight a Custodian. Most of the humans who die fighting Orks will never have a Custodian nearby when it happens. And the Custodians who do range into the wider galaxy are specifically targeting the Ork threats that, if unaddressed, would eventually create the conditions for a confrontation that neither side wants to have in the wrong circumstances. It is a strange kind of relationship, one characterized more by mutual absence than by contact, shaped more by the specific situations where they do interact than by the general condition of how often they do. In a setting defined by constant war, the Orks and the Custodians have spent most of their coexisting history not fighting each other, for reasons that are structural and biological and strategic all at once. What this means for the lore going forward. The 41st millennium is ending. The 42nd is beginning, marked by the return of Robut Guilliman, the formation of the Indomitus Crusade, the opening of the Great Rift, and the transformation of a galaxy that was already barely holding together into one that is openly fracturing along every seam simultaneously. The Custodians are more active than they have been in 10,000 years. The Orks, energized by the war pressure of a galaxy splitting open, are building toward concentrations that may rival historical maxima. This combination more active Custodians, larger Ork forces, makes the question of what happens when they meet more relevant in the current lore than it has been since the heresy. Battles that were theoretical or historical are becoming present. Encounters that were rare anomalies are becoming campaign-level events. And the specific dynamics, we have spent this entire video examining the individual capability differential, the field amplification problem, the psychic environmental change at scale, the preemptive strategic doctrine, the historical template of Gyros Thravian, are all going to be tested against new conditions that neither the Imperium nor the Orks can fully predict. The interesting thing about where the lore leaves us is that neither force is winning in any ultimate sense. The Custodians are more active, more engaged, more willing to carry the fight outward, but they remain few. And the Emperor remains silent on the throne, and the question of what they are ultimately defending toward remains as open as it has ever been. The Orks are energized, growing, pushing, but the specific ceiling of what they can become without the right conditions to create another beast-tier warlord, remains the limiting factor on what the worst case looks like. The tension is not resolved, it is generating, and that is exactly where good lore should be, not in the settled answer, but in the live question, the one that has stakes and history and genuine uncertainty about how it resolves. We will be watching. We are always watching. That is what we do here. The Emperor protects. And until next time, keep asking the questions that open up rather than close down. Like and subscribe if this was worth your time. You know where the button is.